Kirsty Applebaum graduated from Bath Spa University in February 2017 with an MA in Writing for Young People. Her debut middle grade novel, The Middler, won the 2016 United Agents Prize for Most Promising Writing for Young People, and it was recently published by Nosy Crow. Nikki Gamble spoke to Kirsty about The Middler and her next novel, due out next year.
I wonder if we could start just by taking us into the book, whether you could set the story up for us a little bit.
Well, The Middler is middle grade fiction for 9 to 12-year-olds, and it's set in a near future technologically regressed world, and it tells the story of Maggie, who's 11, and she lives in a isolated rural town called Fenniswick. I'm going to read you the prologue, which is very short, and it says, "Our eldest, Jed, got born first out of all of us. Our youngest, Trig, he got born 4 years later. And me, Maggie, I was in between, the middler, worse luck."
There is something about being a middle child. So if you were one of three, say, and the youngest one is at home, I'm thinking about not just in your story, but in real life, the youngest one is at home, they get the attention of their parents, that special attention. And if you're one of three, the youngest could be the last to go to school and therefore gets a different kind of special attention. And in the middle, you could really be forgotten. So I thought this was an amazing concept, really. Tell us how it came about for you.
That was quite an interesting thing, actually, because I started writing the book from an eldest point of view. So I had the sort of concept that the eldest were going to be special. And I started writing it from that point of view. And I probably wrote about 40,000 words. And I kind of realised it wasn't working properly. And I had a sort of eureka moment, I call it. And I remembered something I did when I was at secondary school in English. I was probably about 12. And we had been learning about the judgment of Paris. This is not my area of expertise, so I do apologise to anybody if I get some of this wrong. But Hermes, the messenger, is sent with 3 goddesses to take them to the mortal Paris for him to judge which is the most beautiful. And we were asked to rewrite that story from a particular character's point of view, of our choosing. And I chose Hermes, and I wrote this story from Hermes' point of view, and I handed it in. And after I'd finished it, I thought, do you know what? I should have done that from the point of view of one of the losing goddesses. Because I thought that kind of concept of being one of the people who were sort of slightly on the sidelines would be more interesting, a more interesting story to tell, perhaps. And I remember being really annoyed at myself. And I suddenly remembered this. And I thought, and it gave me the inspiration to write the book from the middle child's point of view. And what happened was I wrote that prologue. I mean, it wasn't exactly the same, but it was pretty much that prologue. And I kind of got one of those little tingles you get when you think your writing's going to work out. And I thought, oh no, this could really work. And so all of a sudden I had this prologue, and I had the title, The Middler, as well. It's quite an exciting moment.
Yeah. So you had the idea of the middle child, and then there's that task that comes next, which is finding the voice for them. And was that fully formed?
With this book, it was just there. It just immediately clicked into place. I mean, I say that I had written sort of 40,000 words already, so I suppose I had been, writing my way through it already. But yeah, it just suddenly, with that prologue, that was it. I was away.
And I don't know whether you can remember, but what sort of actual changes did that bring about in the story?
I think probably the biggest difference it made was it became a more claustrophobic story, which I quite like. It became more confined to the town, Fenniswick, and it gave that more claustrophobic, small, rural town feel to it. I would say that's probably the biggest thing. And perhaps it made it more relatable as well, because I think that although we do have this concept of a middle child feeling not important, and I think to a certain extent that can be true. But I do also, I mean, I'm not a middler myself, I'm a youngest, and I certainly had those feelings when I was young, particularly when I was young. I'm still a bit now, of not feeling special enough. And I think that is common to all children, really, or a very common thing to feel. So I think it makes Maggie more relatable as well, perhaps.
You were going to read us another bit, and I think perhaps we could go into that part of the story now.
I'm just going to give you a tiny bit more background. So we can see that Maggie is a little bit, from that prologue, we can see she's a little bit unhappy about being a middler. And the reason for that becomes clear soon, is that the eldest are considered very special in the town, and so she has that feeling of not being special. So we join them on their first day back at school after a long hot summer. In fact, it's still hot, and we follow Maggie and Jed and Trig to school, and they have an assembly, and we discover during this assembly that there is a boundary around the town which no one is allowed to go beyond. And we also discover the mayor comes into assembly. She makes an announcement that wanderers have been spotted close to the town boundary. And this is very frightening news. She calls the wanderers dirty, dangerous and deceitful. And she says, never go beyond the boundary. And that's how you keep yourself safe and your town safe. But what happens then is that after school, Jed, being Jed, decides he wants to go to the boundary wanderer hunting. And that's the bit I'm going to read. They take a friend with them called Lindy, and she's an eldest as well, just like Jed. And I'm going to read you what happens at that point. After school, we changed out of our uniforms and went up to the cemetery, right out near the hawthorn boundary, hunting for wanderers. It was Jed's idea. Come on, he called down. Who's coming up next? He was balanced in the tallest tree, legs dappled by the leaves and the sun. Looked like he was wearing camouflage. The branches rippled in the heat. Me and Trig and Lindy all squinted up. Look, Jed pointed south, past the red-berried hawthorn. Grandad Cruise's watch glinted on his wrist. I can see for miles. My heart ka-dunk, ka-dunk, ka-dunked under my t-shirt. Can you see any wanderers? Trig shaded his eyes with both hands. Course not yet, said Jed. We've got to watch and wait. He was really high. My stomach swirled just looking at him. Do you think the mayor will give us a reward? I shaded my eyes too. You know, if we find one, will she read our names out in assembly? Jed laughed. You're never going to spot one, Maggie. You're just a middler. You're too scared to even climb up here. Yeah, you're always too scared of everything. Lindy elbowed me and Trig out of the way. Watch out, Jed. I'm coming up next. Jed grinned. It was his idea of heaven, sitting on a branch with Lindy all to himself. She walked between the two graves set under the tree. The headstones had ancient names carved into them, William Whittington and Georgina Millicent Cruz. Georgina Millicent Cruz was my great-great-great-great-grandmother. Funny how the cemetery smelled of grass and soil and sap-laden trees, when actually we were surrounded by old dead relatives. Lindy got a knotty handhold on the trunk and found somewhere to put her first foot. She pulled herself up and found a second foothold, then a third, a fourth, a fifth. She didn't have shorts on like me. She was wearing a stupid white dress that showed her underwear if she even just climbed over a stile. She was nearly up to Jed. My mouth went dry. They were right. I was scared. Of climbing, of hunting for wanderers, of everything. So what, though? So what? We were never going to find one anyway. Jed held out his hand to Lindy. She grabbed it. She leaned away from the trunk and let go with her other hand. Her foot slipped on the dry bark. Their hands slid apart. Her stupid dress blew up around her waist. She bounced head first off the William Whittington gravestone and landed on the ground, blood all over her face. She lay there, still as you like. The sound her head made on the gravestone replayed itself in my ears. Crunk, like being whacked with a brick. crunk. Her pants were white with little blue flowers on them, forget-me-nots. I stepped forwards and pulled her dress down. It wasn't right for the boys to be seeing all that. No one screamed. No one shouted. Jed said something unrepeatable, but he said it really quiet, like his voice had been squashed by the shock. Then he half scrambled, half jumped down from the tree. He tried pulling Lindy up, but he couldn't lift her. Her blood got all over his hands. He pushed his hair out of his eyes and left a messy red stripe across the side of his head. "Lindy," he said in his squashed voice. "Lindy, Lindy, Lindy." "She's dead," I said. "No, she's not. She can't be," said Jed. "We have to do something." And we stood there, all three of us cruise kids, looking down at Lindy Chowdhury with her white dress and her bloody face and her long dark hair spread out on the grass. "You have to check if she's breathing." It was Trig who can't even hop or run or tie proper reef knots. "If she's not, you have to breathe for her. First aid. We did it in school, remember, ages ago." He swallowed. "And one of us has to run for help." Jed knelt down next to Lindy. "I'm not leaving her. You go, Maggie." "Me?" "Quick, Maggie, you got to run." So I ran.
It's a really shocking moment and very visual as well, the way that you describe that. You know, you feel very present in that moment. So tell us a little bit about the background to that scene.
Well, that's quite interesting, actually. In fact, for some time, that was the opening chapter. That was the beginning of the book. Yes, well, I did a master's at Bath Spa in writing for children. And while I was on the course, we went out one lunchtime and we were in Corsham, which has beautiful cobbled streets. And a few of us went out. I think there was just three of us walking along the cobbled streets, and there was a market that day. And there was a lady at a market stall, and for some reason she passed out, and she fell backwards. And she didn't sort of crumple, you know, with her. She literally fell backwards, and her head cracked on the cobblestones, and it made that crunk noise. And I have to say here that we did stop and help. We did call an ambulance and we did leave her in good hands. But that noise stayed with me. I could not get this noise out of my head. And that's when I went and wrote that scene.
So they're off looking for these wanderers who are outsiders, really. Did you know the role that the wanderers were going to have from the beginning of the story, or did their role develop as you were writing it?
I think that developed as I was writing it, yes, and I think I had another role in mind for them originally. I wrote this 40,000 words initially as somewhat aimlessly, and it didn't really work for me. And I have to say the experience has transformed me into a plotter. So I think what I did at that point, once I'd written that prologue and got that inspiration, I then very much kept the setting and the characters. None of that changed, but the whole plot completely changed. And I sort of taught myself how to plot, really, and I fixed up quite a structured plot. So I think at that point, the role of the Wanderers changed.
That's interesting, because I got the sense that perhaps it developed through the friendship that Una had with Maggie, that actually the role of the Wanderers kind of could have developed through getting to know them through that relationship to some extent.
Yes, I think that's probably true, actually. And one of the other things about the friendship between Maggie and Una, and I didn't realise this when I was writing it. It was only when I did a Q&A for Nosy Crow for the blog tour, I realised that I've sort of recreated a friendship between myself and my best friend at primary school. And I did that completely subconsciously. I never thought about it while I was writing at all.
Quite a few of the reviews have referred to the book as a dystopia. And I wondered if that was a label that you would attach to it, and whether you're happy with that as a label for your story.
I had that in the back of my mind. I have enjoyed reading a lot of dystopian fiction. It's something I really love. 1984, Brave New World, Feed are some of my favourite ones. Margaret Atwood as well. So I think that, again, that's been very much in my subconscious because they are books that I've really enjoyed. So when I was writing it, yes, I think that was in the back of my mind a little bit. I wanted to create that feeling that you have a world which is on the surface quite idyllic, but underneath something much more sinister is going on. And I think you get that quite a lot in dystopian fiction. For some people, it makes them think of the Hunger Games and things like that. And I think this is, and I absolutely loved the Hunger Games, but I think this is quite different from the Hunger Games. So I wouldn't want to mislead people into thinking it's that kind of dystopian fiction. But I certainly think there are elements of dystopia in it, and that I did have those in my mind as I wrote, yeah.
Yeah, I think that's what you've just said there is quite important, that readers who come to this won't find a story that is as bleak as the Hunger Games. And I think that's quite important for them to recognise that. Although it's set in a fictional world of Venice Wick, there's a lot of our world that we see reflected through what's going on there, as you would with most dystopias, actually. They're just exaggerations to some extent, aren't they, of what we experience. Did you have anything specific in mind when you wrote the story?
Do you know, it's really interesting because actually I didn't. I wasn't at all thinking about sort of current political situation, but I do realise that in some ways it does reflect that. And then I thought, well, where did that come from then? Because I wasn't thinking that at all. And I think it comes from a couple of things. One is the dystopian fiction that I have read has got those kind of themes in it. And I think for me, it comes more from the fiction I've read than from thinking about the real world. And the other thing I think is that one of the things I really try and do in my writing is create really believable human characters with real human motivations. And I think when a writer does that, you do get human behaviours and human themes coming to the surface. And I think all the things that are happening in our world at the moment, you know, these are human themes that never really go away. You know, sometimes they're more present, sometimes they're less present. And so I think that's why. But I didn't specifically write the book with that in mind, but I do like the fact that, you know, teachers are picking up on that and using it in lessons to explore those kind of issues with children. I think that's fantastic.
I think that's one of the strengths actually of fiction of this kind, is that it isn't specific, and so you can relate it to lots of different circumstances without pinning it down too directly, and consequently it doesn't feel like you're being taught a lesson as such.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm glad it comes across like that.
There's a lot in there about the power of language to formulate your thoughts. I mean, you've already referred to the dirty, dangerous and deceitful, which is almost like a mantra that's chanted through the book. And this is really a very, you know, in all kinds of ways, this is very much a modern concern, isn't it? I think in terms of newspapers, in terms of political speeches, you know, in lots of different ways, that if you've got the right words, then often yours is the message that prevails.
Absolutely. So, I mean, I think one of the things I really did have definitely in the forefront of my conscious mind while I was writing this was I wanted Maggie's sort of character arc, if you like, to go from someone who believes and accepts what she's told to someone who develops her own independence of thought. And I did that absolutely consciously, and I think that is one of the most important things we can do and learn, to make our own judgments based on what we experience, rather than believing what we're told. Because as you say, in this, you know, this world of social media, you know, you have to make up your own mind. You can't always believe what you see and what you read.
And fiction has such a great power to do that. You know, we do learn through the way that characters behave. It's fascinating to me that we do that. One of the things that's going on in the background of this story is the rather sinister Quiet War. Gosh, how sinister that word quiet is. Can you tell us a little bit about the Quiet War?
I did actually write a whole history of the Quiet War, which I will never show anyone. It was to make the book coherent. So I do have a history of it. But what I really wanted to do in this book was confine it very strictly to Maggie's point of view. So Maggie, as a 11-year-old child, has a very restricted experience of the Quiet War. So it just kind of seeps through in little things, like maybe some newspaper headlines she's reading, and maybe in some of the chants that they chant in assembly. So that's entirely deliberate, that sort of restricting of how much the reader knows about it. And it kind of encapsulates it really, because that's why it's called the Quiet War, because we don't hear much about it.
It's interesting because when I was growing up, it was in the period of the Cold War, and equally, I had no idea what that was, but there was this term, the Cold War, but there's no war actually going on around you. So it's quite sinister, really.
Do you know, I'd never thought about it like that. That's a really interesting way of looking at it, because it's a very good parallel, yeah.
You did say that you did the wonderful course at Bath Spa University in writing for young people. I was quite surprised, actually, when you said that you were not a plotter, because the pacing of the story felt really just pitch perfect to me.
I did a lot of research into how to structure a story, how to plot a story, and I have to admit now I'm actually a little bit of a plotting geek, actually. I have cards and I have my midpoint and my inciting incident and all of that. The great thing about the cards is that when I then go to writing the book, of course it changes, and that's the great thing about the cards, because you can take ones away, you can add new ones in, you can move them around, and that's really how I work. So I plot and then I change it as I go.
Great. I wanted to ask you as well about the writing itself. I was thinking particularly about how beautifully crafted the chapters, I think it's 29-30, where the writing style really shifts. And again, I just wondered whether that was intuitive. It's where you have lots of very short lines and you're really building the tension at that point, or whether that was a learned thing.
That was a learned thing. And I learned that while I was on my course. The way it's run is in workshops. So we will write a piece of work, maybe 1,500 words long, something like that. And our peers review it and we all discuss it in the workshop. And I don't think it was with that particular section of writing. It was with another section of writing where it was fast moving. And I got some feedback from actually nearly everybody in the group, so I couldn't deny that they were right, saying that it wasn't moving fast enough. You know, it was a fast moment, but the writing wasn't conveying that. You know, the writing was slowing it down. And somebody told me to look at Patrick Ness's The Knife of Never Letting Go. There's a very tense bit near the end. And somebody told me to have a little look at that, because he writes in these wonderful short sentences. And I read it and it's amazing. So I have learnt that from my peers at Bath Spa and from the wonderful Patrick Ness. And it's transformed my writing, actually, not just that bit. I really try now to be aware of whatever I'm writing, what the pace of the writing should be in that section, and adjust it accordingly.
That experience of being with your peers in that kind of critique circle must be quite a daunting thing. But do you think there's something in that could be quite useful in education, that way of working?
Gosh, well, I mean, I'm not an education expert, but what I would say about that is that when I started, and I would imagine this is an experience common to most people, when I started, I found it very daunting. But the tutors put us at ease, and within really quite a short period of time, because you're sharing your creative writing, which is that exposing experience, you become very close to these people. And we have a very, very close group now. And I mean, I know that these people will be my friends for life, and we help each other with our writing. We totally trust each other. We know each other's strengths and weaknesses, and we rely on each other to give us honest feedback. And it's an amazing thing, an amazing experience, to be an opportunity really to create those kind of relationships with people.
I think just listening to you, what I would take from that is the importance of trust within that group, and where you set up a trusting relationship, whether it's with adults or with children, I think you're more likely to get an authentic response. And also you talked a little bit there about how writing shared in this way is really sharing a bit of yourself with somebody else. And I think perhaps if teachers can share something of themselves through writing, then maybe you get something different back from the pupils that you're working with.
That's really interesting, isn't it? I'm trying to think back now and to my own school days and see if I can remember any experience like that.
Well, I've certainly learnt quite a lot from talking to you today, Kirsty. Before we end our interview, I'm really keen to know what's coming next. I mean, writing a debut novel is one thing, because it's probably already finished by the time a publisher takes it up. My understanding is writing a second one presents a different kind of challenge. So how's that transition been?
I started writing my second book, and I found it yes, it's like the tricky second album, isn't it? How can I possibly write another book? It was very, very difficult. I really, really struggled with it. Unlike Maggie's voice, I struggled with the voice. It took me a long time. I had a very funny experience in that in the middle of trying to write this second book, I got inspired to write another book, which I wrote very, very quickly. The voice was immediately there. So suddenly I had a third book, really, even though the second book wasn't written. And it's that third book that I wrote very, very quickly that's going to now come out second. I did finally finish the other book, and now I've finished it, I am pleased with it. And I did find the voice in the end. So the plan is that the second book, which was kind of the third book, but that's now the second book, will come out next spring, and the other one will come out the spring after. I think that's the plan at the moment.
Okay, thank you so much. It's been such a pleasure talking to you today, Kirsty, and thank you for taking the time to visit us in the Reading Corner.
Thank you, Nick. It's been absolutely delightful.